This episode is supported by MonsterJoysticks.com. Level up your Raspberry Pi with our all-in-one arcade kit using genuine Sanwa arcade parts. And OneClickPrint.com for your photos on canvas, acrylic, gifts and more. Local craftsmen and global delivery. Every story needs a beginning, and the story of home video game consoles is no different. What we have today is not the first, it's not even the first generation of video game consoles for the home, as we'll discover, but it is considered to be the console that kick-started the entire home console industry, and some think nearly killed it in the process. This then is the story of the iconic Atari video computer system. Let me take you back to 1976. The world is starting to tire of the huge success that is Atari's Pong. We've all heard of it, the 1972 arcade cabinet, and one of the earliest examples of an arcade video game featuring simple two-dimensional graphics to simulate a two-player table tennis style game. Atari founders Nolan Bushnell and Ted Dabney, however, had been beaten to the idea of Pong in another electronic ping-pong game built into the Magnavox Odyssey, the very first commercial home video game console released earlier the same year in 1972. We'd all be able to identify the Odyssey as a games console by today's standards. It has controllers and a console-style form factor, and it plugs into your TV set to display a mesmerizing 3 dots on the screen. The Odyssey had an architecture of diode transistor logic comprising of only 40 diodes and transistors. There was no CPU, no score mechanism, no color and no sound. It also had what we'd recognise as cartridges offering 12 games on 6 carts, but these weren't really cartridges as we know them. They didn't hold games in ROM. They were little more than jumpers connecting input pins to output pins in a different formation to set the logic and trigger the behaviour of those on-screen dots. Different behaviours for different games, which were complemented by an overlay you stuck on the TV. One of those games was tennis. Looks familiar, doesn't it? You can now actually participate in television and not just be a spectator, boasted the marketing, and 100,000 Odyssey buyers did just that. Bushnell and Dabney were already invested in the idea of participating with a TV screen, having created the first arcade video game Computer Space in 1971 in collaboration with Syzygy Engineering. It was the first arcade video game as well as the first commercially available video game, and was based on the 1962 program Space War, a program which made its way across institutes with the computing power to run it and students willing to sneak it onto the systems. Wanting to further explore this fledgling arcade market, Atari allegedly instructed engineer ALCORN to create a version of the Magnavox Odyssey's table tennis game as a training exercise, after Bushnell played it at San Francisco trade show before its public release. This story Bushnell vehemently denies, but the infringement of Magnavox's patents was never put to the test as Atari settled out of court for a one-off payment of $700,000. This on the condition that Magnavox agreed, as part of the settlement, they would pursue any other companies creating table tennis clones for extremely high royalties. The result then was Atari releasing over 8,000 Pong arcade cabinets in upright and cocktail cabinet form. Sold at 3 times the cost of production, it was a tidy profit for Atari and a smash hit with the players. The Pong cabinets earned 4 times the revenue of other coin-operated machines, such as Space War. The £700,000 settlement was quickly paid, and Atari was on the map with the advantage that, having paid the settlement figure, they would incur no future licensing costs for Pong, unlike their competitors. While Computer Space is considered the world's first video arcade game, it was the simplicity and social aspect of the two-player Pong game which Bushnell attributed to its success. This, however, was still solid-state technology Atari didn't initially file patents for, and by the time they had filed them, clones were on the market. And it was soon estimated that Atari made only a third of the Pong coin-operated machines in use. Clones made by competitors Bushnell referred to as jackals. Pong's demand and success was such that Atari's competitors considered the returns were worth paying Magnavox their high royalty fees for, and competition wasn't stifled quite as Atari had hoped. Atari was fired up though, and in response to the clones, their solution was to produce more innovative games and new concepts to keep one step ahead. In 1975, Atari released Home Pong, selling around 150,000 units through US department store Sears in the holiday season. These were initially sold exclusively through Sears under their Telegames branding, but were later sold as Atari branded devices. And of course, this too was followed by clones of Home Pong by competitors, and even saw the re-release of that Magnavox Odyssey to ride Atari's wave of success.
With digital scoring, variable speeds, Telstar Hockey. Each player controls a goalie plus a forward on the other side. Oops, a goal. And Telstar Singles Handball, a game you play yourself. Telstar Handball, Tennis, Hockey, all three at an exciting low price. For great family fun, hitch your TV to a Telstar by Coleco.
Some familiar names expanded on the Home Pong idea, including Nintendo's first entry into the home video game market with a Color TV game 6 in 1977. 6 variants of electronic tennis, and not a dungaree-clad plumber in sight. Unsurprisingly though, as wonderful as it was to participate in television, and this first generation of home video games showed us it was possible, the world grew tired of Pong. Atari was still a young and agile company chock full of ideas, many of which would come from Atari's Grass Valley think tank. In 1974, Atari acquired Cyan Engineering, an electronics company founded by Steve Mayer and Larry Emmons, former colleagues of Bushnell and Dabney, and started a think tank to come up with new ideas for arcade games.
We're quite effective in some ways because we don't spend a lot of times in meetings and on dog and pony shows. We're just always getting on with the project.
Bushnell raised his concern about single-game consoles or consoles limited to Pong variants, and they set about working on a console with multi-game support. That console would become our Atari Video Computer System. The think tank quickly identified microprocessors would be needed to give the machine a more general-purpose, reprogrammable approach which could adapt to different games and as yet uninvented genres. But at $100 to $300 per CPU, it would result in a completely unpalatable retail price. Undeterred, the breakthrough came thanks to MOS Technologies' 6502 CPU, introduced at a trade show in San Francisco in 1975. Attending the show, Mayer and Milner decided this was exactly what they needed and were able to negotiate a price of about $8 per chip. We'd later see this CPU or variants of it in the Apple II, Nintendo NES, Commodore 64, BBC Micro and many more machines. Between the MOS 6502 and the Zilog Z80, the touch paper of the home computer revolution would be ignited. The newly sourced CPU then was at the heart of the prototype named Stella, named after a bicycle no less. Engineer Jay Miner, yes, that Jay Miner, considered to be the father of the Amiga, worked his magic to create the TIA or television interface adapter on a single chip. Quite the improvement over the original wire wrap prototype, and that would send the graphics and audio to the TV display. A masterclass in chip size reduction Jay would repeat many times throughout his career. This brings us back to 1976 and the next round of prototyping. Now the 6502 CPU had been swapped out for the 6507 model running at 1.19 MHz. This was a cutback variant of the 6502 and was a 28-pin instead of a 40-pin package, which could only address up to 8 KB of memory as opposed to the 6502's 64 KB. But that was considered a suitable trade-off for the further cost reductions Atari could enjoy. A cartridge slot was added, with games stored on ROMs in interchangeable cartridges, each of which could hold 4 KB of data, although 64 KB could be accessed with bank switching. And 128 bytes of RAM was present inside the 6532 Riot, or RAM Input-Output Timer chip. Yes, that is an acronym within an acronym, although additional RAM could be put into the game cartridges if needed. Jay Miner's TIA chip handled the graphics and sound, as well as some input duties shared with the Riot chip to handle the input peripherals including paddles and those iconic Atari joysticks. Stella ticked all of Atari's boxes, and with a little more development, testing and refinement, Bushnell's baby would be ready to meet the world. He did however feel that once it was out in the wild, those same jackals would try to clone it, reaping the benefits of Atari's research and design costs from a fund which was rapidly dwindling as Pong continued to lose popularity and the revenue stream dried up. Bushnell didn't want the dingo to eat his baby and so made arrangements, official or otherwise, with integrated chip manufacturers such as MOS to withhold sales of their components to Atari's competitors. And then, In an instant in November 1976, before Atari's system made it to market, Fairchild Semiconductors introduced the Fairchild Video Entertainment System for $169.95 across North America.
Play tic-tac-toe, shooting gallery, or just doodle. Switch video carts and play Desert Fox. Switch again, it's blackjack. Or play the 2 built-in games, Pro Hockey or Tennis Champ. Channel F for fun, the Fairchild Video Entertainment System, just $169.95.
Using their own Fairchild F8 CPU produced in their own plant, Fairchild were not affected by any attempts by Atari to squeeze the competition's supply chain. Atari had been beaten in marketing the first home video games console with a programmable ROM cartridge, and if they wanted any chance of success, they had to get Stella on the shelves and fast. Atari needed to speed up development to complete the Stella, and the only way they would do that would be with a large injection of cash. Nolan Bushnell managed to raise the capital by selling Atari to Warner Communications in 1976 on the understanding that the cash infusion would be used to bring Stella to market, and on September the 11th, 1977, those very first units rolled out of the factory in Sunnyvale, California. Codenamed Stella was named the Atari Video Computer System, or VCS, and it would go head-to-head with the Fairchild Video Entertainment System, or VES. Only Fairchild didn't like Atari trying to pass off their system, understandably, with a name so similar to its own, so they renamed their system to the Fairchild Channel F. The second generation of home video games consoles was now well underway. Let's just recap what we mean by second generation. So we could describe the first generation of video games consoles as having discrete transistor-based digital game logic rather than microprocessors, games which are part of the hardware design and not on removable media, a game playfield which occupies only one screen, objects on the screen consisting of very basic dots, lines or blocks, graphics which are mostly black or white, or later in the generation games with 3 or more colours, and either single channel or no audio at all. Compare that then to the second generation, in which we find microprocessor-based game logic, AI simulation of computer-based opponents allowing for single-player gaming, ROM cartridges for storing games so we're not restricted to the games built into the console, game playfields able to span multiple flip screen areas, blocky or simplistic looking sprites with a resolution of around up to 160 by 192 pixels, basic colour graphics generally between 2 and 16 colours, and up to 3 audio channels. What we didn't yet have in the second generation were features such as scrolling tile-based playfields, which we find in the third gen. So back to our story then, the Atari VCS landed in the US in September 1977 with a $200 price tag. It wouldn't reach Europe until the following year in 1978, and Japan didn't get a release until May 1983. 9 games are available on release, including Combat, which is bundled with the system, and the remainder were Air Sea Battle, Blackjack, Indy 500, Starship, Street Racer, Surround, Video Olympics, and Basic Math, seeding the "but it's for my schoolwork" argument for generations to come. 2 joysticks were also bundled with the system to encourage the 2-player social gaming, which Bushnell considered to be key to Pong's success. Uncertainty did surround the new generation of video game systems, with consumers taking time to warm to the additional expense of cartridges as opposed to having systems with games baked right into them. The system itself though is iconic in its simple but distinctive design, with these earlier units comprised of black plastics and wood veneer, giving them the nickname the Woody. Six switches power the machine on, set the TV type to colour or black and white, select the difficulty for each player, allow you to select the game and reset the game. And the cartridge slot sits in the middle, waiting for you to slam in the game of your choice. It is unmistakably an Atari VCS. Between 350,000 and 400,000 Atari units sold in 1977 before production was moved from California to Hong Kong, where a further 800,000 units were manufactured. The difference in these models included a slightly more angular shape and a thinner plastic mould on the Hong Kong units. Our example, which was made in Hong Kong, weighs less than the earlier American-made unit, owing to the thinner mould and therefore plastics. It seemed like a good start, but with slower than predicted sales in 1978, Atari were left with a surplus of 250,000 units by the end of the year. This meant Warner had to bail out Bushnell once again for losses incurred, and Nolan Bushnell departed Atari that same year. It does seem a shame that Bushnell should have left Atari before the system really took off, and the surplus stock came as a result of the numbers he thought the unit would be selling. But a killer console isn't going anywhere without a killer app, and that was yet to come. First there was Warren Robinette's game Adventure. Developed in 1978, the action-adventure game introduced a game with virtual space. That is to say, a game which expanded beyond a single screen and could be explored one flip screen at a time. It wasn't Atari's killer app, but it certainly caught the public's imagination, who collectively marvelled at what might be waiting for them to discover on the next screen just out of sight of the TV set. It put clear air between the games of the first and the second gen systems, and is credited as having the first ever Easter egg in a game, with this message lurking in a hidden room. Meanwhile, disgruntled by their treatment in the company, the Fantastic Four, Atari game designers David Crane, Bob Whitehead, Larry Kaplan and Alan Miller, who had made the system's most successful games to date, decided to leave and form their own company to create third-party software for the Atari VCS. They called their company Activision, and despite many court battles over the years, Atari failed to shut them down, and they led the way for third-party developers to publish their own titles, away from any quality controls which may have existed at Atari. As the game's catalogue grew, so too did confidence in the system. Licensed conversions of titles in the coin-operated arcades, which, remember, were kick-started by the popularity of Atari's Pong, and an abundance of third-party titles, saw 1 million units of the Atari VCS sell in 1979. Atari grew from strength to strength on the increase in sales of the system and growing software library. The Fairchild Channel F, meanwhile, well, that never exceeded 32 software releases on 26 cartridges. Fairchild decided video games was a passing fad and threw in the towel in 1978, although Zircom International did buy the rights to the system, who redesigned it in 1979 to release the Channel F system too. It was little more than refinements to the original design rather than a true competitor to the more powerful Atari VCS, and only 6 more titles were released for it. For a spell then, the second generation video games market was handed to Atari, before stronger competition came along in the form of the Magnavox Odyssey 2, released in the UK under license by Philips as this, the Videopack G7000. Magnavox then upping their game with a successor to the original Odyssey. And in 1980 the Mattel Intellivision came along, both systems which could stand shoulder to shoulder with our Atari VCS, and not the only examples of new devices which were now pouring onto the market. But it was Atari who continued to dominate into the new decade, and then their killer app came. In 1980, Atari licensed Tato's Space Invaders, which massively increased the unit's popularity. Its graphics and game logic were identifiable as the arcade smash and playable on the VCS's chunkier display. Sales doubled to 2 million VCS units. For every VCS sold, of course, multiple cartridge sales followed, and it was through the cartridge revenue from this ever-expanding user base that Atari grossed a whopping $2 billion in 1980. Cartridges set Atari back around $4.50 to $6 to produce, with an extra $1 thrown for marketing on top of that. They then wholesaled them at $18.95. Sales would double again for the next 2 years, and by 1982, 10 million units had sold, and the best-selling game was Pac-Man, which sold 7 million units. We'll come back to him shortly. It was in this same year, 1982, that the successor to the video computer system was released, the Atari 5200. This was in line with Atari's new naming standards, and so the VCS was renamed to the Atari 2600 Video Computer System, or just the Atari 2600 as most of us know it today. Despite the release of the successor to the VCS, or 2600, its life was far from over. In 1982, production costs were down to just $40 per unit, with a resale price of $120. The markup was just too tasty to ignore, and Atari would continue to drive down production costs all the way through to its official retirement on the 1st of January 1992. Even here in the UK, I remember Atari were pushing the 2600 Junior for £50 in 1989. This at a time when the Atari ST, Commodore Amiga, or soon the Sega Mega Drive would be fighting it out to be on your Christmas list. But by then it was a system well past its prime, an aging rock star scraping some money together for unpaid taxes. And, like an aging rock star, it had a few facelifts along the way. The lighter plastic moulding of the Hong Kong model in 1977 was followed by the 1980 model, which moved 2 of the 6 switches to the rear of the console. 1982 then saw the release of the all-black model nicknamed Darth Vader, when the 2600 name was introduced, and consigning the wood grain to the 1970s, alongside Burt Reynolds' mustache, exactly where they belonged. 1986 then saw the cost-reduced Atari 2600 arrive, nicknamed the Junior, in which the architecture was greatly simplified and components consolidated to reduce production costs even further. Retirement comes to the best of us, and after 14 years and 4 months of service, the Atari 2600 was officially retired in 1992, a record it held onto until the Sega Master System surpassed it, owing to that system's seeming immortality in Brazil. And Atari held the record for the best-selling American-made console with 30 million sales in the US until Microsoft's Xbox 360 surpassed it with 84 million units. The final licensed Atari 2600 game in North America was Secret Quest in 1989, and in Europe it was Acid Drop in 92, although there have been subsequent releases of previously unpublished games unearthed in more recent years, such as Pickup and Action Naught by Rob Fulop. So this all leaves an important question. What was the legacy of the console? Was it a game changer? Or was it simply game over? We know it made the company a lot of money, and that it proved video games were a serious and profitable business and not just the passing fad Fairchild mistook it for. But was it all positive? There are very few systems of which it can be said shaped the industry, but that's exactly what the VCS did. Not just its approach to hardware, which Fairchild proved wasn't unique to Atari, but in marrying that hardware to software people wanted, and surviving those initial years after release to capitalise on the new wave of mega hits in the coin-operated arcades. Space Invaders, Pac-Man, Mario Brothers, Missile Command, Centipede, Galaxian, Asteroids Defender, Pole Position, they all made it from the bustling arcades into your home on Atari's console. But there was another library of games for the system, those third-party games we mentioned. Not necessarily by Activision, as they were proven and professional programmers looking for deserved recognition, but by enabling third-party developers to produce titles for the system without the quality control systems Sega and Nintendo would introduce for their later home consoles. Well, anything goes, and anything did go, including a range of pornographic games by the company Mystique, the most notorious being Custer's Revenge, which depicted General Custer performing unspeakable acts on tied-up Native American women. It was distasteful in the extreme, and as Atari was strongly associated with all cartridge releases and not just its own titles, it was very damaging to Atari's brand. But the biggest trauma Atari suffered was of its own making. Hot off the back of the successes of Space Invaders and Asteroids, Atari ported Pac-Man. So confident were Atari of Pac-Man's sales potential that they produced 12 million cartridges of it in 1982. This at a time when the total consoles sold was 10 million. 12 million carts for 10 million systems? What could possibly go wrong? And perhaps making it a good game would have certainly given it a fighting chance, but it was critically panned. Even so, it did manage to shift an impressive 7 million copies, making it the best-selling title to date, but that left Atari with two major issues. 5 million units of excess stock and rising as customers were returning the game in its droves, and a large user base was now disenfranchised by a terrible port of a massively popular arcade hit. This was followed up by the infamous film adaptation of E.T. the Extraterrestrial, which was written in just 5 weeks, despite costing Atari $25 million to get the license. It was rushed out because they wanted it released in time for the holiday period. Atari produced 5 million cartridges, of which 1.5 million sold, and huge numbers were once again returned because, unsurprisingly, the 5-week development time made for a shockingly bad game. This loss of confidence from gamers, combined with Atari's overconfidence in production, played no small part in the perfect storm which we call the North American video game crash, and the Japanese call it Atari Shock in 1983, and the Atari VCS, being the most popular system, bore the brunt of it. There were of course other factors, including the increased competition from the new console manufacturers entering the market, which saturated it, and greater interest in the personal computer market with the Apple II, Commodore PET, TRS-80, and Atari's own home computers gaining traction in North America. Whatever the reason, it shook the industry in the US for 2 years, and it took the Nintendo NES and the third generation of video game consoles to restore consumer confidence in the US games industry in 1985. In the UK and much of Europe, Well, life and gaming continued, as we'd leaned more towards microcomputers for both work and gaming, but we would soon benefit from the lessons of the crash learned by Sega and Nintendo as their third generation systems gained popularity in our region. Atari and the VCS did make it out the other side of the crash, and it continued to sell at a slower rate as a previous generation, cheaper alternative to current tech, through to its retirement in 1992. The Atari VCS or 2600 will always be remembered as the system which brought the gaming industry to the masses in their homes. The system which proved it was better than its Pong heritage, and that programmable, microprocessor-based consoles with interchangeable cartridges were definitely the future. If, unlike Fairchild, you put out the games people actually wanted to play and the marketing through which to sell them. It gave players immense pleasure in bringing arcade smashes into their homes, and occasionally the disappointment of not quite pulling it off. We're talking about you, Pac-Man. And whatever part it played in creating the storm of the US video games crash, it did emerge battered and bruised, but it lived on for another 7 years post-crash. And you can't deny that styling, that joystick, and that wood grain. It will always look incredible. The Atari VCS wasn't the first of its kind, but it was the most influential of the 70s and early 80s, shaping a brand new multi-billion-dollar industry which lives on today, and whose heritage can be traced back to it and the efforts of the team who created it. And for that, I think it deserves our appreciation. Thank you for watching, and take care.